Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of our multimedia presentation for MPA 510, History and Theory of Public Administration. This week we will be discussing if we can run our government agencies like the private sector. This week we were asked by our boss um, to run our government agency more like the private sector. So in order to do that, we need to know what the similarities and what the differences are between the private and public sector. And then ultimately, can the government be run like the private sector? First, we're going to look at the similarities between the public and private sector. And I don't want to use a specific example, but the pictures that you see on this slide are FedEx and the Postal Service and IPS. I also put in a horse and a zebra because at first sight, they look the same. And one of the things that the public and private sector both have in common is the hiring process. And thanks to the Pendleton Act of 1883, people have been hired based on merit since, or at least that's the way it should be, uh, getting rid of the old spoils system. Uh, and I and um, and I'm sorry. And Woodrow Wilson also touched on it on his study of administration, and combined this, and this is known as the birthplace of administration. Sorry about that. Okay. And another thing that public and private sector have in common is efficiency. Both Taylor and Rosenblum talked about how um, the best way to provide services is through efficiency. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the division of labor. Is both sides um, have specialized places where or departments that focus on certain things to provide the services for the people. In this slide, we will be discussing the differences between the private and public sector. And right off the bat, the very first thing that's different is that private businesses, the private sector is profit based. If it doesn't make money, then it doesn't make sense. Um, and unfortunately for the public sector, and Paul Appleby talks about it in his Government is Different, is that the public doesn't get to choose the problems it has to handle. Um, its main purpose is to serve the public, um, and even if it doesn't make money, um, that is not the ultimate goal of being in the public service. One example in the news in the last few years has been the Postal Service. They've been losing money year after year. But again, for the public sector, they don't get to choose problems that are given to them or presented to them. If they're presented with a problem, they have to try to find a solution. Um, and again, for the private sector, they have the ability to pick and choose which problems they want to go forward with. And if it's not going to generate a dollar, then they don't have any obligation to uh, try to solve that problem. The second biggest difference that I found was that in the private sector, there is no job security. And it goes back to the very first thing. If you're not making money or you're losing money, your job is in danger, and very likely you will be fired. As where in the public sector, there is job security and there is job tenure. And Max Weber talks about this in his bureaucracy that if you want good service, you need to offer these kind of protections. Um, in his bureaucracy, he talks about promotion as well. Usually, the public sector tends to promote from within, um, as where the private sector, uh, the at least the high-ranking positions that you hear about are hired from outside the agency. Uh, those would be the two biggest differences, in my opinion, and according to some of the textbooks that I read. This is my reference page to demonstrate which articles I used in my presentation this week. In conclusion, can we run a government agency more like the private sector? I don't believe we can. The differences between the public and private sector are just so different, and in my opinion, there's just no way that you can treat the public and provide a service for the greater good while in the back of your mind or a priority of it being making a profit. At the end, I think Paul Appleby said it best: government is different.